Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we can now please just sort of make our way into the room and take your seats at the tables, and we're just about ready to start. I just wanted to give a few words of introduction. My name is Matthew Howard, and I'm a telecoms media and technology analyst based in London. I've been working for Ovum for the last 11 years, a company which is known in Australia. And recently I've moved to a new firm called Assembly. And one of the things that we've been working on quite a lot recently is obviously what is happening with future deployment of networks. And there are a lot of debates taking place around how that's happening in different parts of the world and different models that are being used. And of course, the Australian example is one that is of particular relevance and very much so at the moment. This is the first of these events from Comms Day. The Global Broadband Futures is a new event. The design of it is broadly based around the Broadband World Forum, which happened very recently in Berlin, in Germany. But again, I think it comes at a time when there's a lot of sharing that can be done from different countries and different best practices around how we roll out some of the new technologies and the challenges that are being faced. So with that in mind, we've got some great speakers for you today, which bring together people from many different countries. We've got the UK represented, we've got Germany, we've got Korea, we've also got the US. Some really good flavours there of different experiences that I think should make for an interesting day. A little bit of housekeeping. There are no planned fire drills, so if you do hear a fire alarm, then head for the exits. We've got them to the side of the room, toilets through the door and to the right, and we'll let you know where the coffee breaks will be when we're ready. Lunch is also provided. Please do stay around after lunch. There is a very interesting panel session, and then of course you'll be rewarded with some cocktails if you can last until then. So really that's all I wanted to say. I want to say thank you for giving up your day. Got a fantastic backdrop obviously to this event. It's great for me to be able to be in Sydney, so I'm very grateful to be here. And first I'd like to introduce Tony Brown, from the NBN, the Public Affairs Manager, just to also extend his welcome to today and to thank you all for being here. Hope you have a great conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for all coming this morning. Particularly a massive thank you to our international guests. They all are very, very warmly welcome here, and we greatly appreciate the effort they've made in coming all the way down to Australia. In particular, I'd like to call out Mike McTighe from Openreach. Where's Mike gone? Is he around there? Mike, who's arrived in Sydney last night about 6 p.m. and will fly back to London tonight about 6 p.m. So a mammoth effort from Mike, thank you so much. Also our good friends from Deutsche Telekom, Bruno Jakob Huberborn and Daniel Brauer, who arrived from Germany yesterday morning and will be flying back to Germany tomorrow morning. So again, a great effort from those guys as well. So this is an event we've been thinking about and planning for a very, very long time. And the reason for that is it gets very frustrating from our point of view, particularly in the public affairs team, to explain to people what's going on in the rest of the world. If we had an unlimited budget, we'd like to fly every Australian, particularly our friends in the media, to Europe for 6 weeks or the US for 6 weeks to find out what's going on in the real world out there. Sadly, that may provoke a few questions and set estimates, which would be rather awkward to say the least, so we can't do that. So we brought the world here to Sydney, or at least as many as we can, to really tell the story of what's going on in the rest of the world in the broadband market. And one of the big frustrations we face, and one of the messages we really want to achieve out of this conference, and indeed you may have seen this morning in the Australian interview with Bruno from Deutsche Telekom, with Supratin from the Australian, is really the message that really we're trying to get out there. The most important thing for every network operator out there in the global market is choosing the most appropriate technology. There's no real point or benefit to be gained from focusing on a single access technology and trying to impose that across the network. There'll be areas of your network that are suited perfectly for one technology and another where another technology works really well. And that's the message that all these guys today will be bringing to the table. So particularly from Openreach, from Mike and Ty, they of course are more than happy to build fibre in the UK, but of course they'll do that in the most appropriate locations and also when they've made sure they've got the right conditions in place from a regulatory and a commercial perspective before they embark down that pathway. And the same thing, as you'll hear later on from Deutsche Telekom, of course they are very keenly aware of the pressure they're under in Germany to build fibre everywhere. Of course that's not financially possible, as Bruno said in the media this morning, so we'll use technologies like VDSL, vectoring and V+, and then of course G.fast before they can go to a nationwide fibre footprint across a couple of decades. And of course the same thing from Jeff Finkelstein from Cox in the US. Jeff had a rather interesting journey here to Australia. He arrived at the airport and without a visa to actually come to Australia, which was a rather embarrassing admin slip on our part. But of course, he, after a long wait, they called the plane back from the runway and he boarded the plane successfully. Well, I think he still hates myself and James for not informing him of the visa restrictions. Apologies, Jeff. And of course, I think most interestingly of all today will be to hear from Korea Telecom. Now, if you ask the average person in Australia about Korea Telecom, here are our friends from Korea on the front table here, Mr. O and his colleagues from KT. If you ask anyone in Australia what's broadband like in Korea, they'd say, look, they all have fibre to the home. They all have fibre to the home, they all have gigabit. That's simply not the case. And you'll hear from our friends from Korea today about how they face this challenge in Korea, of recognising in what is probably one of the world's most competitive broadband markets, with often 4 carriers serving most premises, they couldn't deliver fibre to every single premise. So instead of doing that, they developed new technology, which they will explain later on, that can carry gigabit speeds over those existing copper wires in the buildings, which gives subscribers gigabit speeds, but at far less cost and far less hassle. And of course, our final international speaker is Mr. Martin Sharrett. Where's Martin? Martin around? At the back there. Martin, you may recognise him from his incredible interview on Four Corners recently, where he was the New Zealand representative. Martin was complaining last night that he did a 50-minute interview with Jeff Thompson from Four Corners that got cut down to, I think, 90 seconds in the programme. Martin, you got away rather lightly there. I was interviewed for 6 hours, got condensed to 10 seconds, and now have people ridiculing my choice of hatwear on the day. So you should really count your blessings. You got away very lightly indeed. And of course, we have all our vendor friends and partners here today. A wide range of vendors here today talking about the technologies that will take us to the destination we want to get to in the future, which of course is very fast broadband for as many people as possible. So, of course, we were hoping to have Minister Fifield opening the event today. He has 1 or 2 more pressing matters to attend to in Canberra, so he couldn't join us. He's trying to find out if there are any actual Australians still serving in the federal government. They might find some. But of course, as I mentioned, some of my Australian colleagues at dinner last night, as you'll tell, I'm an Englishman, and I was really rather pleased to find out about John Alexander becoming a UK citizen, so I guess that means we can now claim the Davis Cup from 1978, plus of course all the other majors that he won during his career. So that's good news for us at least. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Bill Morrow, up to the stage to open the proceedings. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Tony. And first of all, let me thank CommsDay for putting on the session today, the sponsors that actually put some of the money forward to bring us together. And bringing us together really is the key so we can learn from one another. No matter where I have worked around the world, and it's been a number of different locations, 3 or 4 different continents, about 7 different countries now, a number of different companies. The one thing that I can tell you with certainty is that no matter how good or how poor a company is, we can all learn from one another. And I think that we share a common objective no matter who you are sitting around the table today. And that is to do something for society, to do something for our communities, to make tomorrow better than yesterday. And at least for what this conference is about, and for what NBN stands for, it's about enabling a digital era an era where people will see better health, an era where people will see better access to education, where people will see opportunities presented to them that they have never seen before. And of course, things like entertainment and social good, social connectivity will all be a part of what it is that we're trying to create. Now, NBN itself, I'm surprised to hear Tony actually even mention that there is something more interesting in camera than NBN, because from my point of view, it doesn't feel like there is anything more interesting than the way in which that we have to interact with the politicians, the ministers. It's becoming a daily event with me, and I swore years ago, decades ago, I have many interests in many different areas. Politics is the only one that I absolutely want nothing to do with, and yet here I am. So, what I want to do is kind of take you through fairly quickly as to why NBN was even created, the design of NBN, some changes that occurred once the government changed, and then the challenges that we face. And I'd like to kind of start the day off with this because I think learning from each of you around how you're actually thinking about NBN, whether it's from your respective countries or from your perspective as a citizen or as a journalist, or even just as a supplier of the equipment. Again, it's important, I think, we share our ideas. But having this foundation, having this ground setting as to why we got started and the challenges that we have is important. So if you think back pre-2009, before NBN was actually established, there were some things that were taking place that the then government said we need to address. First of all, in terms of growth, we were seeing a massive amount of data consumption that continued to grow. Predictions from Cisco, from Nokia, from a number of other companies that were expert in this, right, talked about how this was still exponential in terms of the data consumption that consumers and businesses were going to see. On top of that, we saw new applications that were becoming available and around the corner that were going to have this impact on this health, education, social connectedness, and entertainment. And that if you look at then the access that Australia had, it was limited. We figure there were about 2 million homes in the country out of about 11 million in total that had no access to any kind of internet connectivity. And furthermore, of those that did have access, they were predominantly using ADSL1 and ADSL2 technologies, and the average speed was about 9 megabits per second. And worse yet, there were a number of them on that original ADSL technology that was limited to 1 or 2 megabits per second. And I'm not talking about even at the congestion busy period of the day. This is just the top level speeds that people will be able to attain. Now you add to that the infrastructure that was being used was largely this copper-based ADSL technology and a couple million homes that were served on the HFC cable or pay TV networks. Now, these networks were built by the incumbent, largely Telstra. A little bit of Optus on the HFC side, but it was built by Telstra. And Telstra was forced and eventually kind of volunteered and cooperated to be able to open up their networks to where you would see some retail competition come in. But during this entire time, the competitive landscape was always felt to be on an unfair playing field. Unfair because Telstra, being the dominant wholesale provider, was also the dominant retail provider. Telstra controlled the field workforces to determine what the customer experience was going to be like. Telstra controlled the prices, had inside information in terms of where the network was going to be enhanced, what time frame it was going to be enhanced, and to what degree it would be enhanced. So this was the problem that the then government in 2009 felt that they wanted to correct. So what did they do about it? The first thing that they did is says, well, we are going to establish a unique, independent, wholesale-owned company that is a for-profit company, and I'll come back to this. This is very important. But this company would actually, since it's restricted to being a wholesale only, would also enable further retail competition to occur. And not just because it's wholesale and we aren't in the retail business, but because of other regulatory framework that was put into place to be able to make sure it was an easy entry for retailers to come in to start to sell wholesale services to their customer or their client base. Also, in terms of defining the demarcation between what NBN did and what the retailers would do was very important. Now, in addition to all of this, we said that we would use third-party resources to build and operate this network. And just to put that in perspective, as we stand here today, we are about 6,000 employees at NBN. And we are 24,000 employees outside of NBN through third-party contractors that are doing the construction, the maintenance, the operations, the installation of our networks. So you can look at this now 30,000 people strong organization to change and transform this industry with the bulk of it being by third parties, not necessarily by NBN itself. Now, a very important aspect of this original design was that while it would be largely a new infrastructure, 92% of the nation would get fiber built out to every home. The remaining 8% would be served by a new satellite that would be put in the sky and new fixed wireless towers that would be put up in other areas. So this was about 1 million homes served by wireless and 10 million plus homes that would be served by fiber to the home. Now, they recognized at the time in 2009 that the idea of building ductwork and building new exchanges, new physical buildings to house all of this equipment, the new pits in the streets, that would cost even more money and take longer to build. So the then government in 2011 was the time frame that they struck a deal with Telstra. Struck a deal to be able to use their pits, to use their ducts to pull the cables, to use their office exchanges to where NBN can put racks and equipment within these locations. And that was all designed to be able to accelerate the build and keep the cost lower. I'll tell you in a moment about why that introduces a couple of extra challenges, but it's important that we remember this was all part of the original design. Now, on this other point about when you look at a for-profit company, now I having worked in the US and in the UK and in Brussels and in Tokyo, I can tell you each one of these countries were challenged with trying to find how they get broadband to every house. And for a for-profit company, you'll find these extreme costs on these remote parts of each of these big landmass countries that it doesn't have any economic promise of return. And therefore, private companies aren't interested in going out to build infrastructure into those areas. So governments in these countries that I mentioned would typically offer some sort of subsidy to say, I get that you, private company, cannot make a financial return, but how about if I give you some money? Just so I know that I can extend that digital highway out to these people in these remote areas. And therefore you get a little bit more of these homes in the countries built. But for the vast majority of large developed countries, they still have a percentage of the population that do not have broadband access nor have a plan to get broadband access. So this is where Australia stands out as separate. Not once, not anywhere in the plan is there any kind of tax subsidy, a one-off payment being made to NBN to do this. We do this through a for-profit model to where we take the margins and the low cost to build, high dense areas, and we use that to offset the losses and those high cost to build, low density areas. And when you add all of these up, we're actually able to make a very modest profit. A profit, quite frankly, that none of your investors would be willing to put money into. But because this is a government-owned entity that's trying to balance a social good and a secondary and tertiary benefit, they feel that they can actually have that lower financial return, but very importantly, keep this off the budget, which is one-off taxpayer subsidies that typically occur. So then, that was 2009, and along comes 2013, there's an election, there's a change of government, and then now, which is the current government, comes in and says, well, I want to revise this because while I believe in the user pays model of having an economic profit to where there's not a one-off tax subsidy payment involved, I don't believe the economics of building fiber out to 92% of the premises will keep that off the budget. So therefore, they challenged the NBN company to come up with alternatives. Find a way to do this faster, to do it cheaper, but still, they put performance criteria out there saying that they want at least 81% of the country to operate at least at 50 megabits per second, and the rest can be at least at 25. But more importantly, is let's do this to where, again, it is a user pays model, completely done by 2020. And in fact, they said, we want you to ensure that you focused on the underserved areas. The priority for us is always for those that don't have it, more than those that already have some form of broadband connectivity today. Now, in order to do that, it meant that we had to use existing infrastructure assets, and I mean the copper network and the HFC pay TV network that was out there. And so in 2014, we embarked on a negotiation that J.B. Rousselot actually led the negotiation for NBN, and we concluded a deal at the end of that year that basically allowed us access to own that asset, that infrastructure asset, and to kill all the myths and mysteries and opinions out there. We paid zero for it. It was effectively given to us, and we got to pay for the cost of that carrier that's handing it over to us, Telstra in this case, for any costs that they would bear in the transfer to us. But by having this network, we were able to actually have something at least partially pre-built to accelerate the deployment, to keep that cost lower. And we saw an average of 4,400 Australian dollars per premises to build out fiber to the home, whereas when we're using the copper-based network and we're talking about nodes in the neighborhood and then leveraging the existing copper, we're down into a $2,300 price range. So you can see, an over $2,000 reduction per house to be able to leverage this. And that's not only even the most attractive element, it's also that we can actually turn up these circuits, get a higher speed broadband than that average 9 megabit per second level, faster than any other technology that we would have to do from a greenfield point of view. So this revised model off of the original model, all trying to address the concerns that I mentioned in the beginning, has a number of challenges. And I think this is really important. This is where we look to learn from our peers around the world. This is where I think it's important that all of us in the room, including the journalists and your audience that you have, that we understand these challenges to be able to keep this as the original design set out. Now the first thing is that there's of course a higher cost in Australia, and this isn't the big issue that looks at why is our cost per premise or our price in the marketplace to our retailers more than what you see in other countries. The fact of the matter is that because we are building out to every home, no matter what the cost is, no matter how far, how remote they are, if they have a house in a tree, we still have to build a network to get up there. If they have a house in the middle of the desert, we still have to find a way to be able to give them broadband access. So that adds to our cost that you typically don't see when you compare to other nations. The ducts, the racks, the pits that I mentioned earlier that we lease from Telstra, there's been a lot of reports about the amount of money that we will pay Telstra almost in perpetuity, and it's a big number. We have to recover those costs, right? And that also adds to this cost per premise and the price that we have to charge in order to make that modest profit. Now, if you just take those two elements alone of building these very difficult homes, no home left behind, the fact that we have to pay these extra ducts and pits and racks out there, that drives up the cost that we have to charge to the retailers, which means that that's the cost that's going to be driven up to the consumers. But again, this was set right from the beginning in 2009. And while I am a recovering engineer, and I do love fiber as a medium, if we did do fiber to every home, you have to even charge more than we are today. And we're seeing a bit of a problem, as you'll see, on monetizing the data growth. So in the country, the speed to which we're rolling this out, we've seen weeks to where we've had over 140,000 homes that we've turned up that are then able for the retailers to sell. And we've turned up 50,000 homes within a week in terms of activating them. Well, when you think about you as a retailer, having that kind of inventory made available to you each week for you to be able to go and sell, and you add to the fact there's 180 different retailers in our market selling to that same customer, you have a land grab phenomena that results in a price war. So this price war forces that retail price pressure down. That makes it hard to recover all of that data growth, all of those new applications that are coming in. You just use Netflix as an example. This has completely changed the landscape in terms of the way in which digital networks are used. There was very little monetization of Netflix being introduced in the country. So think about that economic model for a moment. If you look at Netflix, they don't make a lot of cash. You look at their P&L. The retailers aren't able to charge the consumers more, so we as consumers aren't really paying a whole lot more for that. But somebody's having to do a capital outlay of a network, and where is that getting recovered? And that, unfortunately, is NBN. So this is, again, where the model has this challenges of all of these pressure points in different areas to keep with a user pays for-profit entity that gives universal access to everybody and still has a network that was better than what was before. Now, the other thing that makes us unique in this approach is what we call this coexistence period. So, when I think of Deutsche Telekom or Chorus or the people in OpenReach in the UK or AT&T, I'm envious. I'm envious because typically these companies have had their infrastructure for a long time. They've had those pits, those racks, those ducts, to where they've recovered cost over decades, right? So their cash outlay or cost recovery for using those, even if they're pulling new fiber down that ductwork, is very different than it is for NBN. We have to recover that cost, but at the same time, because we're utilizing a different infrastructure that is owned by Telstra, the incumbent today, we're sharing it. So they have their retail customers. Let me explain this. We go into an area, we do whatever construction that's needed, we put a node in if it's an FTTN, and then we declare it ready for service to where the retailers can start to sell into it. We have 18 months from the time that clock began to when Telstra has to shut down their copper-based services. But during that 18-month coexistence period, we have to share the network. And there's all sorts of constraints and rules that are put on us of what we're able to do and not do. And the same thing goes with the pay TV network, to where this cable TV network has a spectrum band in that coaxial cable that's shared by Foxtel for video-based services, that's shared by Telstra during the coexistence period, and then our allocation of it. So you gotta have this three-dimensional approach to your network planning to be able to be sure that you can load up your customers, give them a good service, and plan for the capacity enhancements, knowing that you have these other dimensions and factors involved. Now the last point I put on here, and it's really what I'd like to wrap up with, is the consumer confusion. So in our model, here in Australia, we have multiple different companies that are now engaged and involved. We have demarcation points to where NBN is responsible from the first plate or the jack inside the house back to the point of interconnect where we hand over an RSP's consumer data into their network. And that means just by having that demarcation point in the house, whenever we have to do an installation or a repair, we have to make an appointment. Actually, we're not allowed to. We go through the retailer to make an appointment with that customer to be able to put clean boots on and go inside the home to do some work. We leave, and that's just only our link in the chain. The retailer then needs to perhaps send somebody out with clean boots to go inside that house for the second time. Meanwhile, the consumer has seen a civil works crew come by. They have seen a construction crew coming by pulling cable up to the pit in front of their home. And they may have seen even yet a different crew that comes out to move from the pit to the inside the house. So in the consumer's mind, they are completely at a loss for who is actually building my network, who am I signing up my service with, who am I actually going to connect and use, who am I going to call when I have an issue or a concern. So this is why, well, all for good. And still, I don't know if there is a better model that's out there. What we set out to do back in 2009 still remains important for us to do. Recognizing that this journey, this path that we're on, has numerous complications, numerous speed bumps behind it. And that is what a lot of the times what you read about in the press, what you hear about from consumers that are confused and are upset that they're not getting what they want. And hence the reason why we love hearing from our colleagues around the world of how you're doing this, and what can we learn from you. And if there is anything to learn from us, then we want to be able to share that information. So again, I would like to thank you for the long distance that you've traveled, your willingness to share your company's strengths and thoughts around how Australia can be a better network connected place. And for those of you that are in the audience today, we appreciate your time and your interest in getting this nation fully connected. Thank you very much.